online.
Hello. Hi.
There you go.
Hi, Dr. Valley.
Hi.
Okay, so then I guess you can start with it.
Yeah, I just did.
Okay, so I guess we have everybody, right? Good, and Siddharth, David. Okay, good. Voice can. Okay. Yeah. So we should get started, right? Very good. Okay, so let's get started, folks. So today, Sachin Grover will be defending his PhD dissertation titled, where is it? Oh, sorry. Human-aware planning methods for active teaming. The committee is David Smith, Siddharth Srivastava, and Kurt Wanda, and Kurt and David are on Zoom, and Siddharth is here, myself is here. And then I guess pending successful defense, Sachin plans to join PARC, Palo Alto Research Center. It used to be formerly Xerox PARC, as a research scientist. Sachin received his bachelor's at NIT Rourkela, right?
Yes.
And joined our PhD program in 2016. Prior to the PhD, he did a master's thesis on intelligent tutoring systems with Kurt, and I believe Brett, he was telling me that you hired him. And so we crossed paths, I believe, with Sachin in his very first semester when he took the graduate level AI course that I taught. I don't know what I said in that course, but apparently it managed to turn Sachin into an ardent fan of automated planning. Even before he got into his PhD program and started working in our group, Sachin was a constant visitor to my group. It wasn't very clear why he was hanging around. You know, downstairs was the ITS, but he had lots of friends in the group, and he was angling for ways to connect his research in intelligent tutoring systems and with automated planning technology. So in a way, it's good that we all got interested in the human-aware planning, which sort of connected well to the intelligent tutoring systems and led to his dissertation today. Not surprisingly, his work cross-fertilizing these areas with algorithmic advances as well as human subject study evaluations has resulted in several important papers that have received over about 220 citations to date. He also did 2 internships in Amazon, during his graduate study, at least that I know of. So personally, Sachin is a very helpful guy by temperament and has been part of like the social glue of my group for the last several years. Even before he was actually an official member of the group, he's unstintingly kind to people in and out of the lab. He somehow seems to be the person with the helping hand whenever one of the denizens is in some critical need. So much so that I find it easier to just check with him as to how things are going with others, because he seems to know and he's always there to help them. And so Sachin has a strong yearning for research, and I look forward to seeing what he does in PARC after today's defense. Take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Rao, for your kind words. Actually, I'll just take a moment. Okay, let me start. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for coming to my thesis talk. My talk is titled Human-Aware Planning Methods for Active Teaming. My committee is Professor Subbarao Khampati, Dr. David Smith, Professor Siddharth Srivastava, and Professor Kurt Wanda. As the name suggests, it's a lot about AI systems directly interacting and working together as active teams with humans. This is the core idea, the theme that my dissertation follows. Some of these scenarios are actually really important. I mean, take a very simple example. If there are nurses in hospitals, AI systems can actually work with them for patient care. They can also support them for support the doctors in making those critical decisions, giving them extra inferencing capabilities that might not be readily available in some form. These systems, where these systems have started to integrate in a lot of these critical avenues, there are some extended forms of this where robot is or an AI system is supposed to integrate with human aware methods. What human aware methods I mean are to understand what human might think, human might want, or their tasks, their preferences, and try to incorporate it in its own inferencing process and use it for sequential decision making. One of the biggest example of this has been obviously ITS. As Dr. Rao mentioned, I did my master's thesis in this. So for over 30 years, it has made AI systems that work with students, try to support them in their tasks, and also try to act in a way a personal tutor. This actually the top tutoring system is called Auto Tutor. It was in early 2000. This was one of the good tutoring systems that would interact with students in natural language and try to work with them on their problems and help them. Similarly, however, there is a difference here. The difference is primarily that when we want to bring these systems out of ITS to places like hospitals, there is a need to actually make some changes. You can't really parallelly draw that connection. So the whole idea becomes to take learnings from the intelligent tutoring system and bring it to human-aware planning. And this is how the whole thesis objectives are oriented as well. The in my first work, I explored how human AI techniques or active team idea can be implemented to ITS. Then with the kind of support that student might be getting, we extended it to a scenario which was for not for teaching directly, but to make their own plan of study. That was my second work, which I used to evaluate these techniques, the effectiveness of these techniques. Third, I extended another ITS idea of asking questions to a generalized domain, where obviously we're not asking to test what the human or how well the human can do something, but to learn more about them, elicit their inherent model. And finally, we evaluate the effectiveness of those questions through the user study. So the overview basically follows the same theme, where I'll first explain, give a broad introduction to what human-aware planning is, go on to apply it to ITS, evaluate, ask questions, and then evaluate effectiveness to Q&A systems. First, the background. So human-aware planning has a core idea that comes from automated task planning. What it means is that there is a robot with its own understanding of the world. There is it has been asked that, okay, there is a start state and a goal state. How can you reach them? This model actually includes all the capabilities that robot can do and the changes it can make in the environment. And thus, it is able to, the idea is to construct this plan with the help of this model. This has worked well, and there has been a lot of research in it where it does well given enough time and distance from human. But the irony of this whole situation is that the human has come to the environment. Thus, now the first impact it has is that human, when it comes to the environment, it has its own understanding of the robot. What should it, the idea would then the idea of MR becomes that it should incorporate this new model and try to either explain what changes are there in these two models, or act explicably. What it would mean is like use this model to act in the world rather than its own understanding of the model. Like if there is if there are differences where it would be more difficult to do some work, but in that case, the human will be will feel easier to understand or work with the robot, then robot should use this model. That's the idea. But in this case, the biggest point is that this human is right now an observer in the working environment. I personally extended it or utilized this idea where it was human-aware planning with active participant. That would mean that now, since human is working, robot's understanding of the human also becomes important. This directly can, if we start modeling this, we can actually use it to assist human, teach, as well as actively collaborate with them. This is how the human-aware planning ideas have developed or evolved. So this, in general, this is actually a novel scenario. And just to give you an understanding of as to how this has worked, assume that this MR model is actually the correct model of the environment. Whereas, for example, like a teacher, robot knows what exactly the human should be doing. And then any reconciliation between these two models, its understanding of the human and its own becomes a tutoring process. And that idea, that sort of can form the baseline of what ITS I'll explain in a little bit. Secondly, again, the MHR, if we model it as a separate entity, then we can actually assist in their activities and provide support and also active collaboration. Coming to my first work, this had, I will actually follow a basic theme in all these projects, where I'll first present the challenges. Secondly, then I'll present how it was modeled. And finally, I'll present an overall evaluation. So starting with applying human-aware planning technologies to ITS, the basic challenge here becomes when a student is working, to understand the granularity at which the student's model should be, robot should be using. For example, if you assume that a student has a simplest action on the interface that it can take, and then at the top is it can complete all the syllabus and the problems and the knowledge concept. The robot is supposed to find the exact granularity in this parallel and present it to give them feedback or any kind of support. It needs to infer the actions of the human, which is usually supported by some kind of interface in ITS. Model techniques to provide this support, and finally bring it out in a real world classroom system. I'll go in reverse order to actually show how it's working. First, so modeling a classroom. I divided the classroom into a tuple of 4, where first was the knowledge concepts that a student is supposed to learn to master the syllabus. Second is the tutoring material. The teaching material could be in the form of written material or the videos. Third, the assignments for mastering those or practicing those knowledge concepts. And finally, the equivalent model, the student's model, which is an personalized model of each student that can possibly. We applied it to Dragoon tutoring system and see how it works. Dragoon was actually the tutoring system that I used in my master's thesis. So I'll explain what Dragoon does with an example. So in Dragoon, Dragoon is helping students to learn how to model dynamic systems or write equations for dynamic systems. These dynamic systems are, for an example of it is, suppose there are moose in an area. Their population is 20. Every year, the population increases by 20%. Then how exactly does it work? How does it grow? So that idea is what it would help. And in this case, what a student needs to do first is actually define several quantities that would explain how the moose population is growing. And then eventually they can see this kind of an exponential growth graph for their small model that they had. applied. This requires one of the concepts that are present, that were taught to students in the class. In this case, if we have to model, understand what exactly these models mean, then the MR becomes, MR is all the actions that a student can do on the tutoring system. And MHR tracks the knowledge concepts, or how they are actually transitioning from learning to a learned state where a student might want to go. In this case, we ended up using some of the expert knowledge, and we showed that even then it can, how it can provide support to them. We used a few planning techniques to provide this support, which was techniques like plan generation. I'll give the examples of this on the Dragoon directly pretty soon. These were the 4 techniques that we used, and there was a human-aware planning technique as well, which was used to provide feedback to them in some form. We ended up using it for 5 challenges in ITS, which were validate their work, recognize what they're doing, summarize, and provide on-demand curriculum, and or through solve a jigsaw problem. I'll talk about these problems now. So validating. First of all, if I show you, this is actually the plan followed to complete one of the problems on Dragoon. It is a 20-step plan. And once if student comes back with some sort of solution to the problem, our system can actually provide them the specific place where it has an unsatisfied precondition, or some kind of constraint is not valid. So this behavior was actually shown by Dragoon as well, where the Dragoon also tried to point out what exactly moose population has an empty expression field, which was actually pointed out in this plan in our system as well. So we continued. Now we come to plan recognition. Plan recognition, as the name would suggest, that it is about recognizing what the student is trying to do. In this case, it would mean that there are multiple ways to solve a problem. In case, if there are 2, for example, there are 2 ways in which a student can solve, then our system was able to recognize which exact hypothesis is true, and which one is false and which one is true. And this could be recognized from the steps that the student has taken on the system. Finally, the problem summarization. It uses something called as landmarks, where again, when there are multiple ways to solve a problem, there might be some constraints that have to be true while solving the problem. That would mean that these are the predicates that a student has to complete before they can solve in whatever form they would be trying to solve the problem. Our system was able to say, okay, there have to be these 5 predicates, which are actually 5 quantities that have to be complete, and these have to be completed for the student to solve the problem. It becomes more and more interesting when there are open.
Can you just make sure the slides are being shared? I think, yeah, it's only showing, I mean, for the people on the Zoom, especially the committee members, they may not be able to see clearly the slides. Yeah. So I think, yeah, the room is being shown, but
I have a copy of the slides and I'm just going along with it. So it's not.
Yeah, much better. Way much better.
That's good. Thanks.
That's okay. That's okay. No,
sorry.
Okay.
Okay. So
yeah.
tips and hence the problem summarization becomes showing the landmarks in that, and it shows some kind of granularity or hierarchical kind of a structure that students are provided, where some kind of summarization is shown to them. So moving on to the 2 problems that I talked about, on-demand curriculum and jigsaw problem. They were the more recent problems that were not particularly with ITS, but with other tutoring technologies. Like on-demand curriculum is something that happens a lot with MOOC. the massively online open courses. In that case, what's happening is basically MOOCs have a lot of students that don't really complete their courses. One of the ideas could be that they really want to learn a specific topic or complete a specific tutorial. And in that case, if they come to our system, they can actually ask, okay, they want to complete a particular assignment. From their current understanding, we can try to predict what exact tutoring materials that they need to learn before they can complete this topic. And this is what the explanation becomes, where we recognize what the current state is of the human. And you end up using a lot of expert knowledge in this. We are not learning this, just to know it. Coming back to the Jigsaw problem. So Jigsaw problem was a lot about maintaining or having a classroom where students are interacting with themselves and there are groups created. So we used a method of making groups dynamically where the students who are ahead in their work can actually help the students who are lagging behind or who are at the top of the class can help. So we created this system where if we have a particular set of knowledge concepts that students need to learn and tutorials that a student has to complete, then we would give some sort of a formulation as to how the groups can be followed and what particular topics can these systems can where the students can work together. This led to an overall decrease for the number of steps that would be needed or the number of time total time taken to actually work on these topics for the whole class. And we also evaluated this idea with a lot of different class configuration, where the number of concepts were 10, students were 20, but then overall classes needed from 3 to, there were 4 assignments which were needed to be completed with for 10 tutorials with random assignment of these tutorials. We compared some 50 different configurations and we found overall it led to a different, different number of steps that students would needed to follow. An important point here is that this metric itself was something that we created. This can be any new metric that a teacher might want can be integrated, which could be the group size or increasing or optimizing some other functions. This basically became my first work where I evaluated whether these human-aware planning techniques or automated task planning techniques can be applied to ITS directly. This led to a lot of, for me to understand a lot about what a human model could be and how the transition is happening. And then I was able to apply it to some state-of-the-art Dragoon system, which has been used in many classes at ASU. We were also able to handle some of the recent challenges from MOOCs. And this actually brings me to the next work, which is to evaluate this system with the stakeholders, where we are able to show that these techniques are able to provide support and behave like some systems that have already been created. There are still real challenges of actually working with humans, showing their effectiveness of these techniques, and also handling the engineering challenges that might come about. For example, as I told you earlier, there were these plan constructions and all these modeling was required, and these plan construction took a lot of time, whether this would stand in the work well in the real world scenario. So we created this system where, again, students were the stakeholders, and they were creating a plan of study for their own master graduation. Again, the system provided a similar kind of support. I'll quickly show you how. And it led to us evaluating those techniques for providing support to evaluate the effectiveness of those techniques. The rules of the domain were, again, something very similar to how we graduate. Like there are 30 credits. Each subject is 3 credits. There are deficiency courses. There are specializations. there is a defense. Two thesis-related courses have to be completed, and defense has to be scheduled in the last semester after finding the committee. So these were the basic rules that we used, and in this case, the model again became that where those rules were the model of the human, whether they knew about it or not. And it was integrated with the current robot's actual model, which was about working on the interface. And it incorporated these rules, assuming that the human didn't have any understanding about these rules. Even if, point to note here is that there are several, this would provide a lot of extra feedback to them or extra support to them. But would it still work or be effective is what we wanted to check. This was the interface that we created on the first part. I mean, the left part of the interface. You see the initial state, which contains all the student information. Second, the middle part is all the actions that the student can take, which is for building their own IPOS, which is to add a course, add a chair, add a committee member, and schedule its defense. And on the right, it shows all the plan that the student has constructed. It also has some of the other functionalities like validate, suggest, and check. Since in this case, we were actually providing support for the task that they are doing, which is to make the plan of their graduation. We only concentrated on understanding the plan that they had constructed. So we divided it into 3 different parts, which the first part is the plan that the student has already constructed, the sub-plan. Second is the sub-plan the student is currently working on. And finally, the plan suffix that is needed to complete this task. In this case, since we are providing support, these 2 sub-plans were actually part of the same, they were the same idea. And we only had visibility of this. We ended up, the functionalities that I showed were very similar to what automated task planning techniques are, like checking whether their IPOS is valid or not. In this case, if, for example, here the IPOS consists of this one course of taking the course of artificial intelligence. Obviously, this won't lead to a completion of their degree. So this check button actually gives them feedback that this is not a valid IPOS. The validate button, once a student clicks the validate button, they get a more detailed feedback, which is to whether they actually need to complete this deficiency course before even taking this subject. Suggest involved actually suggesting them how they can complete, also incorporating their own plan that they had constructed. And finally, we had this something, we used the human aware idea again to explain, which was to provide the explanation to specific courses or specific steps of acts in the plan that were added. And a student can actually check and learn more as to why these actions were added to the plan. So there were 4 conditions for the, now switching to the user study. There were 4 conditions for the user study. One was in which a student only had access to control the check button in the interface. Second was condition was the plan validation technique, where plan validation was available and they would get step-by-step feedback. Plan suggestion, where the system would suggest and explain why certain steps were added. And finally, condition 3 was where they had both these functionalities present. The user study was conducted with 56 students. There were 13 to 15 students in each condition. And students were recruited through a department-wide email. And out of these 18 out of these 56 students had already constructed their IPOS. The process of this user study was that every student created 2 IPOS, followed by a feedback form after each one of them. So we had 3 different hypotheses in this for the user study. The first one was more related to whether user whether the support actually helped the user in some form, or whether, and it also meant we also basically we calculated it through the time, and we also evaluated their satisfaction with the plan of study and the interface. In the second hypothesis was more about the decrease in condition, like since the students were beginning to constructing two different IPOs. The second one, while constructing the second one, they would have already understood they should have ideally understood the rules of the system. Thus, when they construct the second interface, second IPOs, then the time should further decrease. And we wanted to see if that is actually the case, based on the feedback provided by the system. And finally, the third hypothesis was that there would be the students that are actually not experts in constructing their IPOs, we would see a lot more change in their understanding through with the feedback provided. In all these hypotheses were based on what kind of feedback our system was providing. And since C3 was providing the most feedback, followed by C2, followed by C1, in all our hypotheses, we assume that this would be the order in which the effectiveness would show. I'll not. So coming to the hypothesis, this for now, the first hypothesis was about time, and this was the time taken by the students while completing one iteration of the IPOs. And we can see that there are certain steps. There are, in the first case, we see that there is only a statistically significant result for the control as compared to the condition 3. However, in the second case, actually, we see that both C1 and both C1 and C3 had a statistically significant improvement was seen in comparison to C control, whereas C2 was not did not show any statistically significant result in the improvement based on the feedback. Coming to, I want to talk about this time decrease. Whereas we had assumed that there would be a strict improvement as to how much time did it take, and because of the feedback that the system is providing, we didn't. We only saw that the statistically significant results were for comparing C1 with C control and C3 with C control, where we showed that the students actually found this the feedback from the system useful. Overall, we had a few hypotheses that stood, and there were a few that actually didn't work well. But overall, it showed that there was some usefulness from their own feedback and some effectiveness of these techniques for all the validation as well as the overall the system. The biggest takeaway from this user study was that it was actually we were able to model the humans' understanding. Even if we assume that they didn't know anything, we were able to provide some effective feedback to them for their own work. And finally, we were able to construct this first of its kind user study, which has deployed some of the human-aware planning techniques directly to the stakeholders. Now I'll switch gear and talk about my third work, which was about asking questions. It can be understood like, for now, if you see it, that this MHR we have been assuming in some form. I tried to relax and see if robot asking questions about his understanding of the humans model can lead to some refinement into understanding the real human model. Thus, this work itself is also motivated by ITS, where a student gives a test at the end to understand about its learning, to show its learning over the course. A similar kind of idea was tried to implement to take it for different scenarios. A biggest difference from ITS that comes is teachers usually have a set of questions, or the ITS usually has some set of questions that they would like to show students. Whereas in this case, a robot in the real world, if they want to ask something about their model, a human's model, it might not be possible that they have a set of questions with them. This sort of became, since we're trying to work directly with humans, there are some challenges that have to be noted here, which are based on directly interacting. First one being that we should only question the behavior that a human can take or work in the environment. These questions should be easy to understand and easy to solve for the human. And any response that user might give to the robot, it should help robot understand some part of the model of the human. This was the basic idea. However, so the first assumption that I put here is this, which is MHR is assumed to be a set of models where we assume that the true model lies in that particular set. A quick understanding of this MHR could be that, for example, if there are, suppose, a set of constraints that human usually has an understanding of, this it has its own understanding of the abilities based on those constraints and actions and what it can take in the environment. However, if robot particularly wants to ask about some specific constraint, then it can basically either phrase, there would be two possible models that that might exist. One would be that this constraint is actually present in the true human model, and second, it is absent in the true human model. So in case if the robot wants to ask questions about 10 different constraints, then there would be 2 raised to power 10 possible models. Something like this has existed in the literature, something called as diagnostic questioning. And in this case, as I assume that the MH is part of the human model, ideally the robot would want to construct a question where if a response would actually point to a different set of models. However, as the situations become more complex, this might not be possible because the question can be too confusing for the human, or it can also be difficult to solve for them. Thus, ideally, a robot would want to do something like this, where a response, that there are a smaller set of possible response, which can split this set of models that are possible. This idea I take a little further. Now I'll actually talk about modeling how this algorithm works, and I'll go through the hypothesis space, which is this set, and the assumptions we make on what kind of questions and responses are possible. And then I'll talk about how this question can actually be constructed. In this case, if we have a set of models, then on the this MCon is actually the most constrained model, and this is called the most relaxed model, which the constrained model consists of all the constraints that the robot wants to question about are assumed to be true. And similarly, the relaxed would be that they are assumed to be false. Thus, this is the easiest model in which a task can be completed, and this is the most difficult one. So, funnily enough, I actually call MCon as the Murphy's model, where whatever constraints or whatever could be wrong is actually wrong in this model. So, taking it further, how the idea begins is that for the simplest scenario would be that there is only one unknown constraint P. Thus, there would be a model that would exist, MCon minus, where the P is removed, and this where the P is true. And in this case, the plans that would exist between these two models would only differ because of this constraint. Thus, the query actually becomes questioning about that plan. And this becomes the query becomes the initial and the goal state. Now, there are two assumptions on the response that we can put. First, the response is a simple yes or no. Since there are queries, the first assumption was to actually ask, and the response is only yes or no, where the predicate is present when a human responds no, that they cannot complete this task. And similarly, if the constraint is absent, then the human would respond that yes, they can do it. Similarly, if the response is a plan, then this kind of condition exists between the costs of the plan in specific model. If the cost of the plan provided by the human is greater than the cost of this plan in this model, then the predicate is present, else it is absent. If we extend it to multiple constraints, there are a few conditions that need to exist so that we can ask these questions, where we assume that these constraints, application of these constraints, one constraint doesn't affect the application of another constraint. When it does, we would need to actually ask about them individually. Then the distinguishing plan in each model should have a different cost or some difference. And there shouldn't be assignment of blame issues, where basically it means is that if a human says no, that they cannot construct the plan, then the robot shouldn't be confused as to which constraint led to that failure. This became the baseline, and we constructed 3 different queries with respect to this. First was the validation query. The validation query was about where the response was yes or no. In this case, we provided the user initial state, goal state, and the plan, and asked whether whether the plan in their understanding, would it be feasible. Second and third queries are where we tried to get the response as a plan from the user. And these 2 queries differ because in plan generation query, the robot can only query about one predicate at a time, because failure can lead to some sort of a negation response that, okay, if this constraint is present in the human model, then the specific plan is not feasible, or they won't be able to construct any plan. Whereas in template queries was a specific condition that we explored in our work, where multiple constraints could be merged, and those conditions led to that, okay, each model, the plan in each model would be a different one. As following some of the automated task planning literature, we were able to show that if the robot has to ask about this action with P unknown constraint, then it needs to ensure that this action is actually the landmark for all the plans that are possible in the human's model. And making goal state thus became easy, that all the add effects of this action can be called the goal state. And whereas the initial state became, with few changes to the initial working environment, what could be the initial state that you would like to talk with the human to actually complete the plan. We evaluated this system with a lot of varying constraints using IPC domains that are available as benchmarks for planning in the planning community. We ended up showing that validation query and the plan generation query were possible for all of them, but the template queries were actually a little less, and only 30% of the 30 to 35% of the situations you could convert to template queries. And the maximum time that even with a more unknown model, the maximum time taken was somewhere around 30 seconds. However, we also evaluated that if supposedly there is a bigger model in the environment, then how the time gets affected. We found that even if with the bigger model, there was no particular change in the time. And we tested it for rover domain by increasing the objects. Moving on to actually evaluating the effectiveness with the real user study. Now we have a question. We have 3 different types of queries. We have the questions, we have the response assumptions. Can these assumptions really be made for the real world scenario? Can we actually assume that if we give them an initial and goal state and explain them the environment, would this work? so this was the basic idea, and we created a teaming scenario in this case, where there is a human, Sam, and there is robot Squeaky. They're working in a warehouse. And Sam understands some security rules that the robot is supposed to follow. Such as, these could be like, the robot should keep its arm close to its body. Robot can only pick one box at a time. And in total, there were 6 such rules. The interactions basically become that robot asks question whether to learn how the student or the user applies these question or applies these security rules while constructing the plan. So the user study followed, it had 6 interfaces, and we followed a simple progress. I mean, how the students were shown. First, they were introduced the Sam, Squeaky, and the warehouse. They were introduced a subset of security rules. Not all students saw all 6 rules. We divided them into 4 different subsets, subsets of 4 different rules, and only for one of those subsets was actually shown to the student. There was a pretest. That pretest was more to help them learn the rules, where a list of rules with some distracting rules were given to them, and then those rules, they would choose from that list the correct rules that were shown to them early. And after every iteration of those rules, they followed 3 iterations. After every iteration, right rules were again shown to them. So this helped them learn through the process of working with them. Then we introduced the interface. Finally, we asked questions. Important point to note here is, irrespective of the subset of models that were shown to them, we asked them questions about all 6 rules. And then finally, after completing all the questions, they were asked for feedback, which was to understand their opinion about the different questions. Since we had 2 different queries, we constructed 2 different interfaces. It followed a similar 3-panel structure, where on left, we asked them the question. In between, we showed something about the plan, and in plan generation, whatever plan they constructed, it showed. The actions for, this was the panel that they used for actually constructing this plan. On the right side, we showed them the rules that were security rules that were possible or that they had learned about. This sort of became an exercise more on applying these rules rather than remembering them. And that was the idea by showing these rules. Finally, they could actually submit and go to the next question. The hypothesis that we had were more on whether, based on the clarity, the ease of understanding, as well as the ease of solving these problems. And ease of solving was seen through time taken, and clarity of questions was actually evaluated from the specific objective feedback given to them. And finally, the ease of solving queries was again understood as to how they feel that the questions were easy or not through an objective feedback on a scale of 2. This user study was conducted with 30 students, and average time taken was somewhere around 35 minutes, with 11 minutes as standard deviation. And the 2 different subsets of rules that I talk about, there were, luckily for me, they were randomly chosen. It got divided into 15 in each subset, and 14 out of 30 students actually had worked with robots or some sort of simulators in their previous on their own. Every student was asked questions about every security. Overall, we found that average per query time for these conditions had a statistically significant result, whereas total time taken didn't. We found that overall, for all 6 rules, the time taken was same. But for template query and the plan generation query, as well as validate, we found that construction against validation, as well as template query against validation, had a statistically significant result. So basically, those problems were actually more difficult for the student to solve. However, the other side of this is they actually felt that these problems were equally easy for them to solve. And there was no statistically significant result, even if the results for template query, the average score for template query was a little lower than the validate and construct. Overall, we were able to show that these systems, we were able to pose them questions about rules that they would understand, ask them to apply for it, apply those rules, and see whether what they understood. And we were able to infer the real model that was constructed. The questions were easy to construct, and it didn't take much time. And the time taken to basically, since it was offline, this whole system, the questions were constructed by me separately. And the questioning the behavior methodology, where asking them what to do in a specific environment can be useful in all these real world scenarios like hospitals, etc. This sort of brings me towards the end of my talk, and the overall concluding remarks that I have is that human-aware planning techniques can model a lot of domain-dependent technologies like ITS. They can also be applied directly to over real-world scenarios and critical scenarios such as hospitals or restaurants, or even providing support at Navy and etc. These techniques are effective. The kind of support that they provide is actually useful, even if we make a lot of assumptions on how to model the current state of the user that would be interacting with them. And this domain independence, techniques can be useful. So, but the next question becomes how to actually integrate it with the exact domain-dependent technologies that exist in the world. Like, obviously, ITS has its own assumption, where it assumes that the stochasticity in the student's understanding of the concept becomes very important. How to actually integrate C works like human-aware planning techniques works, and take it to incorporate those assumptions and see how far this support can go, or would it really be needed to actually have that kind of changes to human-aware planning techniques. That overall, this work has actually led to a few publications for me. In this presentation, I talked about these 4 papers only. This work overall has been cited in the past few years, and currently this is my citation count as per 2 weeks ago. I would like to give some acknowledgements since I am about towards the end of this presentation. I really want to thank all my committee members, especially Dr. Rao and Dr. Van Len, Dr. Srivastava, and Dr. Smith for their support, because I have continuously interacted with them over the 4 years, over the 5 years, where I have worked and in their close proximity, and I try to learn from them a lot. I would like to thank the funding agencies, especially the one headed by ONR funding agency headed by Dr. Jeff Morrison, because it was one of the primary source of funding for me throughout my PhD. I'd like to thank my lab mates, Sharad, Tathagata, Salek, Anaga, Zara, Ram, Utkarsh, Siddhant, Alberto. After this, I won't be taking the names, I promise. Working with them throughout all this time and learning from them, asking questions, discussions, they have led to incorporate a lot of changes and in my own understanding. There are quite a few friends that I have. I've been lucky enough to have a lot of friends that have directly or indirectly helped me over this times. And finally, I'd like to thank my family, my mother, to all the growers that are there on the on the Zoom link, especially Naveen Bhaiya and Kapil Bhaiya, and my cousins, my in-laws, as well as most importantly, my wife Saiba. Due to all this learning and their dedication and their love towards me, I have been able to handle all the pressure, and their support has been pretty much constant at all these times. Through their dedication, I'll be actually continuing to join Xerox Spark in early August. This kind of ends my talk. Thank you.
So there is going to be a public session for questions, and committee members can ask questions anytime, but other people in the room are on Zoom. If you have any questions, can ask that now.
I think, where was my picture in the acknowledgement?
You didn't show to
You never went to any of the...
Yeah.
Well, with regards to bringing such model reconciliation-based active teaming approaches to actual products and implementations, what challenges do you see taking your research to the next step and actually turning it into a full-fledged product?
The biggest challenge that I face, I think that exists is to actually understand the core assumption difference, like I point out for ITS. For them, in ITS community, it becomes essential to understand that it's not a complete 0-1 kind of a model. They know the rule or they don't know the rule. They are actually learning the rule. So they assume it to be a curve kind of system. We might need to update our assumptions to actually incorporate these changes. And then probably we can say, okay, we have the system that we can apply to you directly. There has to be a more formal analysis. This sort of became the first initial step. My thesis became the first initial step as to how these systems would it even work, because human-aware planning and automated task planning was used to work completely separately, and these systems where theoretically they could be applied, they were never really done.
Great question.
So this is Kurt. Is it my turn to ask questions?
Yeah, go ahead. Can you increase volume? Yeah, go ahead, Kurt.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you? I understood the 3 sections of your talk perfectly well. It's great stuff, but I do have questions about the third part, the question generation part.
Yes.
So if you could bring up the slide, I don't know what number it is, but it's the one that shows the user interface for validation versus the other 2.
You see different types of queries.
Not this one, the user interface that the students have to deal with. That one, yes, that slide. Okay, for the validation query, there's a plan there in the plan box.
Yes.
It has 3 actions in it.
Yes.
That surprised me. From the earlier discussion, I thought that you were just asking, here's your initial state, here's your goal. Does there exist any plan at all?
Okay. Actually, I asked them for a specific plan, and it can work at the validation query as it was set up. It can work, but then there has to be some more assumptions that have to exist, and that is usually not the case. So basically, we ask them a plan as well to ensure that this validation can be. Validation query can directly be asked from the user.
Well, what I'm concerned about is that when you have those 3 actions there,
yeah,
and you've taken one predicate out of the initial state,
yeah,
and the user says this plan won't work, then you know that one of those, 1, 2, or 3 of those actions has to have in its preconditions the predicate that was deleted from the initial state, but you don't know which one it was.
I actually, since I have the underlying application model of with the robot, I actually know that where that application is. So basically, the robot here has an understanding of the rule as well as how to apply them. It has its own understanding of the environment, and we showed it that only human understood, and we can evaluate only because actually I'll bring it up.
Isn't that kind of weird that the robot knows the correct plan and the human doesn't?
That was basically the scenario we created. In this case, if you see that I pretty much assume that this action, which is the exact action with the unknown predicate, is the one that has to that the robot wants to query about. And that is why this validation query becomes more important, the way it is constructed.
Right, but what if there are two landmarks?
Sorry?
What if there are two landmarks?
What if there are two landmarks? At that point, basically asking about the specific, if I understand correctly, if there are two landmarks,
then you wouldn't know which one needs to get the precondition, which one has the precondition in the user's model.
That actually is an interesting case. I remember one of this. Like, I can give you a very simple example. If going from one room to another room, there were two specific actions, which were that a robot was part of the robot can go slowly, but can carry more load. I actually had, I mean, I have thought about this situation, and I had a specific reason for putting plans there. It is skipping me right now, but I can think over it, and actually I can get back to you on this.
Well, let me ask this is the kind of question that I know is really kind of not legitimate in this setting, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is there was a kind of a big design decision made early in the query project. One, you already defended the idea that you just don't ask about the rules because, you know, they might be, it's natural language and it could be confusing and all that.
Yes.
But you could present them with a plan that only had one action in it. Then you give them an initial state and a final state, and you simply ask them, can this plan work?
Yes.
That removes all the ambiguity that we're talking about here.
Dr. Wellen, that usually involves a lot of changes that might be needed on the part of initial state. Like the robot is going on, okay, this is the environment around you, but how I make these changes, and now I want to go to the goal, and would this plan really work? And this can actually be counterproductive. That's why I try to keep the initial state changes as well to the minimum. I'm
not sure why you say changes. Can't you just have any initial state you want and any goal you want?
I could, and then the plan of action, then your question is actually absolutely correct, that there would be a single action. But the communication, it also takes a toll as to how do you communicate all those different initial states to the human. And that communication has to be brought out, okay, that there is a environment around you. If I just do these two changes in the environment, can it go to the goal state? This is what I mean by the changes. For specific scenarios to exist and cut down the problem, but not also have single step actions.
Okay, can you go back to the slide with the user interface again, please?
Yes.
Whoops, I passed it. There we go. So I'm looking at this plan. I'm kind of squinting my eyes here. And it doesn't give a complete description of the initial state. It doesn't, for example, say what block A's size is. Doesn't say what whether the robot is crouched or tucked, or where the robot's location is. If the initial state isn't fully specified for the user, how can the user validate the plan?
This actually is the initial state that was part of how the interface was explained to them. In that case, till then, I had not really given them the real initial state, and which comes a little later. So at this point, I had just shown that, okay, there are boxes, and they can be moved, and they can be taken from one room to another room. I created a smaller model with which this plan can be constructed, and I showed it for the interface, which would make it easier to explain it to them. And at the end, while explaining the interface, I say that this doesn't follow the security rules, and those are your job to ensure that the plans are secure and complete as per you understand. I only showed the interface because this is what I used to explain it to them. I sort of put it in the slides.
Yeah, well, okay, let me ask a very specific question. The first action says pick up box A on the table. Okay.
Yes.
Where's the robot? What table is it at? Is it even at a table? How do they know?
Consider I'm near table 1. My hand is empty. Box A is kept on table 1. It's actually shown there at the top.
I am near table 1. Okay, that takes care of that.
Yeah.
My hand is empty. That takes care of that. And box A is kept on table 1. Okay, what about tucked and extended?
Actually, from the video, I had shown that, okay, the global interface, environment is, I'm standing near table 1 and my hands are tucked and I am crouched near the table 1. And that is what is near access, what I can access.
So they should always assume that the robot is tucked and crouched? And that's in the instructions to the user someplace?
Yes.
Okay, well, that answers my question. Right, so I guess I'm still a little bit confused by sort of the elaborateness of finding a diagnostic question, because it's as you mentioned, there was a lot of work, mostly in medical, to figure out what the optimal sequence of questions to ask in order to converge upon a hypothesis, which is, what they called the differential diagnosis. And it turns out under certain conditions, you can get it down to, I think, a log number of questions, where the log of the number of predicates. Now that's made more complicated in this domain because, this is another question I had. When you talk about constraints here,
yes,
I think that I'm a little confused about whether you're always inferring a positive predicate as part of the preconditions, or can you also be inferring a not of a predicate?
When I modeled it, I actually assumed both, and in fact, I also considered possible effects. But all these constraints actually became part of preconditions while constructing the user structure, because they were just part of constraints for the actions.
So when you say minus P, you might mean actually minus not P.
Yes, and at that point, I actually I model it as generally as possible. Yes.
Okay.
So
all right, I'll let somebody else have a chance. I've wasted too much of your time. Thank you.
So if there are any other public questions before we go into the closed session for the committee, yes, go ahead. Yeah, so based on cost of the plan, you are
oh, okay. This is clear, right? That it would be easier with respect to P predicate. Now, what changes if the cost that the human provides at that point, if this is greater than the plan in this model, then we can say that basically it comes from MCON model, or basically affected by the presence of that predicate. And thus, we can say that this predicate is present. Else, in other case, we can actually say, I don't directly equate it because people can have a lot of, they non-optimal, but I try to, basically, I make this assumption that the human is an optimal planner. And then we can say this. Basically, the cost is more, so that would mean that the predicate is actually present. And it is actually, the human's true model is the constrained model instead of the relaxed with respect to P model.
Can I ask a question about this slide too?
Sure.
In the bottom row,
yeah.
It's okay. Suppose that the predicate we're interested in is tucked, okay?
Yeah.
And the action is just moving. So the user could say, yeah, I can get around the absence of being tucked in the initial state by adding the action tuck to the plan. But now my plan is 2 actions long. 1 tuck, 1 move, and that makes it longer than the one that on the left side of the inequality.
Yes.
But if we're up at the top row, the human is not allowed to imagine that actions are inserted into the plan that the human is given. So if the human is given a plan that just has move and the same initial condition, which is missing tucked, then they can't imagine that they put a tuck action into the plan, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other public questions? If not, then we will end the public session. Thank you all for coming. And then we'll start the private committee of the session. So pretty much, even also people on the Zoom who are not committee members should leave right now.
Dr. Srivastava, have some samosas and jalebis. What I'll do is I'll actually.
Yeah, you need to stop recording.
Okay. I'll stop.
And then yeah.
Where it's